When we arrive in our course in terms of narrative genre, we arrive to the setting analysis. Setting analysis is a very important step in the process, the exegetical process. And some of this will be new to you from the first course. Some of this will definitely be new to you because we didn't discuss it in the first course. But when we talked in the first course about historical background, history and culture, that's where we're kind of going with this as well. But there's some other elements to it since we are dealing with narrative, a different genre than the epistolary genre. The setting is concerned with the when and the where. When did the story take place? The story that we're learning, the story that we're studying, the passage that you're going through. When did that take place, and where did it take place? At what location? Where were these events transpiring? So that's what we're dealing with when we think about setting analysis. We want to think about the manners and the customs that are inherent to the characters of the story. Remember, we've already looked at the character analysis. But we want to deal more specifically with things that surround their culture, things that surround who they are, how they lived, and get an understanding and put a perspective upon exactly when and where these stories took place. So, knowing the setting of the story is needed in this aspect of exegesis, in the process of exegesis, because it helps you, the preacher, better understand the theological truth that's contained in the text itself. Remember, I started this course by telling you that just as narrative, just as epistolary, there's theological truth contained in the text, and that's what we're trying to discover. That's what we want to unearth. That's what we want to understand, because we cannot preach what we do not know. And part of narrative, studying the narrative genre, is that we have to look at this aspect of when did the story take place, where does the story take place. Both are critical. And so that's what we're looking at now. And so let me begin to give you a procedure, kind of an understanding of how to go about doing this. And the procedure seems very simple. It's not as detailed as you may think. However, once you start working through the process, it does take time to do this. So you want to be aware of that. The first thing you want to do is note all the physical aspects of the story. The physical aspects of the story. And I give you some options here. You want to think about the specific place. Maybe the name of the city is mentioned in the passage, or even if it's not mentioned in the passage, maybe from the surrounding context of the passage, you know exactly where this is happening. So you want to be able to know the specific place. You want to know something about that place. You want to know something about that city, how it's designed. You may want to look online and find ways of being able to understand more about that specific location. Another aspect to this is specific objects that are in the story. If there's a boat, then that means there must be a sea, and so you need to understand about the sea. Like Jesus did ministry around the Sea of Galilee, and sometimes he was in a boat and he was walking on water, going from one place to the other and crossing the sea or the Sea of Galilee while he did that. So you want to know about specific objects. If there's a synagogue in the story, you want to understand about synagogues. If Jesus walks into a synagogue and makes statements, or there's a synagogue in the story, you want to know about that. You want to know what's that all about. So you need to know about specific places, specific objects, and specific kinds of activities. That's crucial as well. These are what I call the physical aspects of the story. When we talk about specific activities, for example, Jesus walking into a synagogue, you want to understand not only what a synagogue is, but that's the object aspect of it. But the activity part is, do you know what the worship service would be like in a synagogue? Are you familiar with that? Are you familiar with how that would work? Within the Old Testament, would you understand how battles take place? If there's a battle, do you understand the, the geographical layout of the battle, what kind of armor would they have, what kind of spear. You say, well, is that really important? It could be. And so you want to make sure you don't forget to look at those things, to examine those things, to think about those things, especially when you're looking at narrative genre, because it is so very important to be able to do that. So you need to first note all the physical aspects of the story, look at specific places, specific objects, specific activities. The next category to think about is the cultural aspects of the story. The cultural aspects of the story. As you read the story, you need to think through about highlighting and noticing and observing what may be certain customs. There may be certain customs that are taking place. You know, when you think about Jesus in John 4, and he goes to Samaria, Jews would not walk through Samaria. They just wouldn't do it. They would go around Samaria. And you say, why would they do that? It was because of a belief that they had, because of a viewpoint that they had, a custom that they had. And so for Jesus to walk through Samaria and then talk to a woman in Samaria, that is countercultural in that day, to do something like that. So you want to be aware of the customs, how people oriented themselves. We live in a different era. We live many years beyond the first century. And that time frame is not our own. And so our customs could be different. Our lifestyle could be different. You know, we have Facebook, we have internet. But that didn't exist back then. And you say, I know that. But think about it. Facebook has changed our culture. Even in our generation, there are people who have always grown up with Facebook. They would not know what it would mean not to have Facebook. And so even some customs that we as older individuals that may be aware of, that Facebook was created in our lifetime, we know what it was like to not have Facebook. There are people in our younger generations today that they don't know that. So the first century had customs that we're not aware of. We're not accustomed to that. That's not a part of our world. It's not a part of our thinking. It's not a part of the way we live. And so when you're interacting and studying a story that was in the first century, in the land of Israel, or even Old Testament times, you want to understand the customs of the people as much as you can. So this is where the research comes in. This is where it will take time to be able to find out this kind of information. You want to think about the social values. There are some times where some groups value something over another group. And it may be a biblical truth, but it may not be a biblical truth. Some people's social values go against biblical values and biblical teachings, but it's still a part of their social system, social value system. You just need to be aware of these things, because those things impact why people say what they say and why the characters do what they do. And so you want to be aware of those things. You know, there's the rich young ruler. He comes to Jesus and he's asking about eternal life. He's bringing all of his culture and his customs and his social values along with him when he talks to Jesus. He assumes that getting eternal life, obtaining eternal life, will be something that he can do because he most likely would have the money to buy it. Because in his social value system, the more money you have, the richer you are, the easier it's going to be to get into God's kingdom. The easier it's going to be to please the Lord, to please God and go into God's kingdom. But see, his social value didn't connect to biblical teaching, and that's what Jesus has to correct. What Jesus is doing there is opening his eyes to the reality that your social value system is wrong. And you're on the road that leads to hell. You're not born again. And if you're going to be born again, you're going to have to change the way you view life. And it's going to be a radical change. So people have their social values. They have their belief systems, very similar. People operate according to a certain belief system, belief structure. This is how they are. This is what guides their life. And if that belief system is not in connection with biblical teaching, then it has to be corrected. And you need to be aware of that. You have to ask yourself the question when Jesus, he's talking about going to the cross, and Peter says, "You're not going to do that." And Jesus has to say to him, "Get behind me, Satan." There's a lot of belief systems being attacked right there by Jesus in terms of Peter. Peter's operating according to a certain belief system. And Jesus has to correct that. So these things are in the text. They're there. You just have to think about them. You have to, when you're reading the passage and you're going through the passage and you're looking at your characters, when you think about the setting of the story, you got to think about these cultural aspects and the attitudes of the characters. You got to think about attitudes. I mean, are they upset, angry? Are they joyful? How are they portraying themselves? You know the story of the prodigal son. It's really a parable of two sons. The second son was really angry, and so you at his father, right, for allowing the younger son to come back and restoring him to the family. You need to understand about why would he be angry? What causes that anger? What causes that attitude to manifest itself? Why would Jesus talk about that? Why is he mentioning that about that character? What's the purpose of that? So you want to deal with physical aspects, and then you want to deal with the cultural aspects of the story. And this gets you on the road to being able to help yourself understand more about the setting, the background to the passage of where this story is taking place and when and how all this is working together. The third category that you want to look at when we're talking about setting analysis is the temporal aspects. Now this category, you may actually not find anything. There may not be anything in your passage that relates to this part or this category that I'm going to discuss with you. But you want to at least be aware of it. When I talk about the temporal aspects is what's going on in current events when that story is happening. So what's going on politically? What is the political time frame? Now, even though in the passage there may not be any direct reference to politics, or a king, a government, or a nation doing something, there may be nothing related to that. Now, like in Luke 2, in the birth narrative, there's a census that takes place. There's definitely something political happening there. But even if you've got a story that has no relationship to anything governmental or nation, which you would find more of in the Old Testament, right? But in the New Testament, maybe there's passages that just doesn't have it. You still want to be aware of this. You still want to be aware that Israel is under Roman authority, Roman rule during that period of time in history. You got to be acquainted with that. You got to be aware of that. You can't forget about that, because that could impact something in regards to the story. It may have no impact on it. It may not relate at all to what is happening in the story, but then it could. You think about the book of Acts, and when Peter goes to the house of Cornelius. Cornelius is a Roman soldier, not just any Gentile. He's a Roman soldier. And like, whoa, here's Peter going, to a Roman. Then the political stuff comes up. You want to be aware of that. So I want you to at least consider these aspects here, the temporal aspects, even if it doesn't show up in your passage. Just be aware of them. Think about it and make sure you check off that box before you skip it. You also want to think about national events. Not just the political climate, but is there anything happening? They come to Jesus and they tell Jesus, there was this tower in Siloam and it fell and killed people. Well, that was an event that had already taken place. They're talking about that to Jesus and getting his opinion about it and asking him a question in regards to it. But you would want to be familiar with that tower and what that tower looked like if you can just, find that out. And so that's a national event. It would be like a tragedy that took place in that period of time. So again, you want to think about national events, political time frame. What about world events? World events. Anything happening in the world, at the time when Jesus lived, what was the rest of the world like? What was happening? What was going on? Again, it may not have any direct impact upon your passage. But you still need to be aware of these things. You still need to check off the boxes to make sure you've attempted to look for these things, because if you don't do it regularly, you'll come to a passage where you do need to do this. And it's just very, very important. So you want to note all the temporal aspects of the story. Now, the final category you want to think about when it comes to setting analysis is other aspects of the story and what I call the wider context. And some of these things that we're going to talk about are going to be very familiar to you, because we looked at the same thing in the epistolary genre in our first course on fundamentals and mechanics. So this is going to be kind of a review, but then there's some extra stuff here too. So when we talk about other aspects, you want to talk about the biblical writer. So this would be like Luke for the Gospel of Luke, Luke for the book of Acts, Mark for the Gospel of Mark, Matthew for the Gospel of Matthew, the Old Testament writers as well, John for the Gospel of John. So the biblical writer. Sometimes the biblical writer is actually a character in the story. That's what happens in the book of Acts. Luke shows up as an actual character in the story when he travels with Paul. But Luke is not a character in the story when he writes the Gospel of Luke. He's the biblical writer. So you want to do an examination of the biblical writer similar to the way you did it back in the first course. The second one is the biblical audience. So, for example, these Gospels, who are they written to? What designation? You have to remember about the Gospel accounts. The events that actually took place that are recorded in the Gospels, that was AD 30 to AD 33. The time in which these books were actually written in book form was in the 60s, 30 years later. Some say maybe the mid-50s, but good conservative dating is around the 60s, early 60s. You have about 30 years or so of time that's taken place. And so when that book is being put together, when the Gospels are being written, they're written for a certain audience. And you want to be aware of who that is. And just like you did that same kind of work for the epistles, you'd want to do that same kind of work for the recipients of the historical books. What is the author's purpose in writing this book? He chose not to write an epistle. He chose to write a gospel, a narrative. Why did he do that? What is the ultimate purpose of the book? So again, we looked at that back in course number 1. We did this. You did the same kind of exercise. You just want to do the same thing for the author, for narrative, in looking at the author's purpose in writing. Number 4 on this little list is the date of composition. So when was it written? I told you that the Gospels were around AD 60 or so. What about the Old Testament books, the Old Testament narrative books? You want to be aware of that as well. So those first 4 under this other aspects, they're familiar to you. We've looked at those before. But what is new is what comes next. Under these other aspects, you want to talk about the broader context of the character and the broader context of the story. You say, what is that? Okay, you've noticed your characters, right? That's why we started with character analysis. We started there. You already know who your characters are from within the story. Remember, in character analysis, you actually study the character from within the story. You describe the character from the story itself. Now I want you to branch out and look beyond just your immediate passage. And so, for example, Martha and Mary. If you're going to look at one of the passages that relate to Martha and Mary, that passage that you're looking at, either in the book of John or maybe one of the other Gospels, that's not the only time they show up. That's not the only time they're mentioned. You want to be aware of their broader context, okay, of the character themselves. Know a little bit about them from the other stories that take place. You may can deduce a little bit more about their attitude, about their character, their social value. You see what I'm saying? You may can deduce more regarding them. That's not in the immediate passage that you're dealing with. When I talk about the broader context of the story, what you're thinking about there is that you have the story itself, but this may relate to something larger. In the narratives especially, your story can take place within a larger story. Well, remember when we looked at epistles, we talked about contextual analysis, and you're looking at your paragraph, and I told you to look what comes before and what comes after it, and within the structure of the epistle, the layout of the epistle itself, where does it fit? That's what I'm talking about here. In terms of your story, where maybe Jesus has been in Galilee, and this immediate passage that you're studying, there's more that surrounds it. The reason you have this story is because you had this one before it and this one before that. There's all these connections. So you want to be aware of that. You want to think about the characters, where they show up, the broader perspective on them, and the story itself. What happens before it? Where happens after it? Where is it at within the larger scope of the book that you're studying? So when you think about the broader context, it's similar to what you're doing with contextual analysis for the epistles. Very similar. These are the things you want to think about. These are the things you want to look at. These are the 4 categories. You want to look at these other aspects. You want to look at the temporal aspects. You want to look at cultural aspects and physical aspects. You want to do that. And the point I'm going to make is that takes time. It takes time to actually do that work, to do that. It's a lot of research. You're going to be having to ask questions about, okay, what's Capernaum? Where was that located? What was that little town like? Why would Jesus make Capernaum his home base? How far is Capernaum in relation to Nazareth? Is that even important? Nazareth is where he grew up, It's where his family was. So you want to think about all these things. That's what you want to look at. Physical aspects, cultural aspects, temporal aspects, and these other aspects. Now, in terms of setting analysis, I want you to look at the example that's on the web page. It's also should be in your notes as well. And the passage that I've been studying and working through is Mark chapter 3, verse 20 to 35. And I want you to see that I work through the different categories that I just described to you when we talk about the procedure. You'll note physical aspects. He's in Capernaum in Galilee. He's in a small house. We talk about a small home for a poor individual. There's Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the half sibling. So I deal with that. And then in this story, the scribe. So I'm dealing with where are these people located? What are they doing in terms of the physical aspects of the story? And Jesus is teaching people in the home. Then I looked at the cultural aspects. So it talks about that there's food in the house. So what would it be like to have a meal in a poor home? How would that work? I talk about what we call the priority of the family, because Mary seems to be, and the half siblings seem to be willing to come and try to get Jesus to stop doing what he's doing. Then I talk about the religious position of the scribes. Who are they? And we looked at them already in terms of the character analysis, but what about the aspect, the cultural aspect of their religious beliefs? So again, I'm kind of expanding on some more things in terms of who these characters are, but I'm looking at these various aspects that I described to you. In terms of temporal aspects, there's none here that affect the story. And then when we get to the other aspects, you'll notice here the biblical writer, the biblical audience, all of these categories. What I'm doing is I'm writing summary type sentences in like an outline format. you can see how I put this together, kind of a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So just follow the example. And in terms of making sure that you look through all these different categories. The broader context of the characters, you'll notice I talk about Jesus' mother and half siblings. I give more about them and more about the scribes. And because they're two of the main characters in the story. And I want to talk about them outside of that immediate story. The broader context of the story, I deal more with other aspects of how the story is connected to a larger whole and what's happening in that area. And so, again, if you go back and look at history and culture from course number 1, contextual analysis from course number 1, those resources that were provided for you, online resources, online commentaries, Bible introductions, those are the resources that's going to help you in doing the work here, in doing the research. So you want to follow the example, use that as a guide to help you in doing the setting analysis of your story. And then when you have that done, you will have character analysis done, setting analysis done. The next one is scene analysis. And we'll look at that in the next session. But when you have all these things completed, then we can think about the plot of the story, and we bring it all together. Working towards the what, why, how. So, hopefully this has been helpful to you. Follow that example. If you have any questions, let your professor know. And more will be explained in class, and we'll have time to interact with more about this and do some workshops related to this and do some, hopefully you'll receive a passage in class as a group that you can work through in terms of these things and kind of get a perspective on how to go about accomplishing setting analysis when it comes to narrative genre.